Welcome to Policy Implications. In this podcast, we dive into new research in economics and finance and ask what it means for policymakers in the real world. This season, we focus on Ukraine, the war, the economy, and the institutions that will shape the country's future. I'm your host, Olha Zadorozhna, an economist working on Ukraine and Ukrainian myself. This series is supported by the Economists for Ukraine network and Kozminski University. Today I'm joined by Tatyana Deryugina, a distinguished economist who has published in top economics journals and is a strong supporter of Ukraine. Tatyana's recent work looks at how to measure corruption and how Ukraine compares with other countries. We'll talk about whether Ukraine is really as corrupt as the headlines suggest, how good our standard corruption indicators are, and what her research implies for policy and for Western support. Tatyana, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me here.
Of course. Before we go into the details, what first got you interested in studying corruption and, in particular, Ukraine?
Yeah, that's a great question because my background is in environmental economics. So corruption is a bit outside of my mainstream research interests. But as part of my work for Economists for Ukraine, we saw that there was a lot of need to develop better measurement of corruption. And so I just decided that my time is best used where the need is greatest. And that's how I started going down this path of developing better metrics of corruption.
Yes, great. And talking about our specific topic for today, so when people in the West talk about Ukraine, corruption comes up almost immediately, sometimes even before the war or reconstruction, and that shapes public opinion and political debates about support for Ukraine. So, from your perspective and your research, how worried should we be about corruption in Ukraine relative to all the other challenges the country faces right now?
That's a great question. And I think the answer is that Ukraine is not as corrupt as the most vocal people say. At the same time, there are problems with corruption, and they should not be ignored for the sake of, fighting a war. I think it's especially important to go after corruption during wartime because unchecked corruption can take away much needed resources to fight the war. It can also lower people's morale. So I think we should be concerned about corruption, not because it's extensive, but because having any corruption during wartime could be very bad.
I completely agree with you. And we often hear very strong language, phrases like utterly corrupt or hopelessly corrupt. These phrases get thrown around in media and political debates when talking about Ukraine. And based on the evidence you work with, is Ukraine really as corrupt as that narrative suggests? Or is there a gap between the rhetoric and what the data show? And how does Ukraine compare to other countries you've studied?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a big gap between what people perceive as far as corruption in Ukraine and what the reality on the ground is. And there's a couple of reasons for that. First, I think perceptions of corruption change pretty slowly. Certainly, Ukraine and other ex-Soviet countries had huge corruption problems in the 1990s, to some extent in the 2000s. But if you look at any objective measures and also some subjective measures, Ukraine has made a lot of progress, especially since the Maidan Revolution of 2014. And it is much less corrupt. And it's, getting closer and closer to the level of corruption that we see in EU countries on average. Although I think there are still some problem spots that do remain. I think the one thing that is especially important to keep in mind when it comes to corruption is this perverse formation of expectations where if you see somebody get arrested for corruption, your perceptions of corruption go up. But just because nobody is getting arrested for corruption doesn't mean that corruption doesn't exist. So paradoxically, if you have a free press and you have strong anti-corruption authorities, both of which Ukraine currently has, then the perception of corruption could be going up, even as actual corruption is decreasing.
Oh, that's very interesting. And I definitely want to come back to this point later on in our discussion. But before that, I would like to raise an issue of subjective versus objective measures of corruption. And so a lot of these narratives about corruption in Ukraine are backed up by perception-based indices. And these are what experts or business people feel about corruption rather than what they actually experience. So, what are the main problems with relying on perception-based measures of corruption, like the classic indices journalists love to quote, especially in a country like Ukraine?
Yeah, I think the problem is you don't know where those beliefs come from. The reason that those perception indices became popular is precisely because high-level corruption is difficult to measure objectively. It's pretty easy to measure what we call petty corruption when you bribe a police officer not to give you a ticket, because that is fairly widespread, and surveying the population about those kinds of experience can give you a pretty good objective measure. But when it comes to corruption by, say, procurement officials or high level officials that regular people don't encounter on a day-to-day basis, asking about corruption experience becomes an infeasible way of measuring corruption. So people turn to perception-based indices, but then again, the question is, well, where do those perceptions come from? And it can be a very noisy measure of what is actually going on the ground, especially because some of these indices maybe have just one or two experts per country, and the same person is getting asked year after year after year. Um, and some of those people don't necessarily live in the country in question. And even if they do, again, what kind of experiences are they having? Even if they're a very smart person and they're genuinely trying to give their best opinion, that is very difficult to do if they themselves don't witness what corruption goes on. So I think it's kind of like those perception indices are a black box. We know something about what's wrong with them. So people have studied how they change over time, but we don't know enough to kind of correct the black box and get the right signal. So I would say it's overall a very slow moving and noisy signal of what corruption is like on the ground.
Well, I really like the black box metaphor. I think it displays and portrays the perception-based indices very well. And so, in one of your recent papers, you and your co-authors use household survey data to build a more objective, if I may say so, measure of corruption based on whether public sector households can afford their lifestyles given their official income. So, could you walk us through, in simple terms, how this household based measure works and what it tells us about Ukraine compared with other countries? Does Ukraine still look like an extreme outlier once we look at these type of evidence?
Yes, that's a great question. And the idea is really simple. Suppose I observe two people making $30,000 a year each. One works in the public sector and one works in the private sector. And then I observe what they consume. If they're both consuming the same amount, that suggests there's no other source of income that the person in the public sector has. But suppose I observe that at the same income level, the person in the public sector is consuming a lot more than the person in the private sector. That suggests they have some sort of hidden income stream that they're drawing from other than their official salary, which may be bribes or kickbacks, things of that nature. And so by doing these comparisons systematically and measuring the gap, of course, the larger the gap is, the larger the likely amount of hidden income is, the larger the corruption, the extent of corruption is. So that's what we do in the paper. We have lots of these surveys for many countries, and we don't find that Ukraine is an outlier. Unfortunately, we don't have data for the most recent times because the longitudinal survey that we use to get these data stopped being administered in Ukraine in the 20 teens. But even then, when corruption levels were arguably higher than they are today, Ukraine is not at all an outlier on this metric.
Oh, that's very good to know. And moving on from the personal income and personal level corruption, in another paper of yours, you focus on government procurement, basically how governments buy goods and services and use these data to, and you use these data to rate how competitive or distorted different markets are. So what exactly do you look at in the procurement data, and how does that help you detect potential corruption or collusion in sectors like, say, construction or infrastructure, both in Ukraine and also in other countries?
Yeah, so the idea that we implement is also very simple. We develop a benchmark that tells us what should be the expected concentration of winning firms' value. So obviously, procurement auctions can be very different. Some are for very large jobs, some are for very small jobs. And so just looking at, what percent of the total auction value do different firms capture isn't going to tell you about whether that's abnormal or not, right? So, because if there's one big auction for, let's say, a stadium that only one firm can win, that can skew a very simple statistic and tell you, oh, that firm is winning too much, but it's really because the auctions are not uniform. So, what we basically do is we come up with a measure of firm value concentration that tells us whether firms are winning a disproportionate share of auction value relative to what we'd expect if they were all equally likely to win. We focus on high value auctions, 250,000 euros or more, so that we don't run into this problem where maybe there's very small firms that never stand a chance of winning something for 250,000 euros or more. And of course, there could be other reasons why some firms are more likely to win. You can have some firms that are just much more cost efficient. So, in addition to calculating each country's deviation from the benchmark in each sector, we also see how does that compare to other countries, right? So maybe we expect some deviation from the benchmark because of differences in costs, but there's no reason why the deviations should be vastly different in different countries. And what we see, for Ukraine is a mixed picture. So in some sectors that we look at, Ukraine does very well. It's kind of in the middle of the pack and not statistically different, really, from many other Western European and Eastern European countries. We do see a big red flag in the construction sector where Ukraine's benchmark is many, many, or Ukraine's metric is many, many standard deviations above the benchmark, much higher than other countries. And so to us, this suggests that this is a very useful approach to target specific sectors because it is a little bit also silly to say an entire country is corrupt, right? Corruption is not a binary all or nothing thing, and there's no reason to expect it anywhere, frankly, to be uniform. You can have some sectors that are very clean, look very competitive, and then some sectors that raise red flags. And that's what we saw in the procurement data for um, Ukraine versus other countries. I should also mention that, I don't want to single out Ukraine because we also saw red flags in other sectors for other countries, right? So in some sectors, we see that Poland is looking like a big outlier compared to other countries. And so this can be useful not just for identifying where could Ukraine use additional scrutiny, but for other EU countries as well.
Ah, very good. Interesting. Do you remember which sectors in Poland raised the red flags?
I can look it up quickly.
No worries. Maybe our listeners will just have incentive to read your paper, and that's how they will find out. But moving on. So indeed, so you found some red flags for Ukraine, especially in construction industry. And so what would that imply for policymakers who would like to target some anti-corruption reforms, what they matter most?
Well, I think, one amazing thing is that we're already able to get these data. So Ukraine is doing a lot of things right in that these data are publicly available and allowed us to scrutinize the procurement auctions and to find the red flag. That's very important. If we don't have the data, we can't find the red flags in the first place. So this kind of openness is very important. Having an independent anti-corruption agency that's empowered to go after anybody that is suspected of corruption, including ministers, not granting anybody immunity from corruption persecution is very important. And I would say Ukraine is doing fairly well there, although it could ensure even greater independence for the anti-corruption agency. And then I would say, using these metrics at a higher frequency to flag potentially problematic sectors for further investigation. So we can zero in on the construction industry and see that a lot of the problematic auctions seem to be in 2021. So our data from 2018 to 2021, and if you construct the metrics year by year, 2021 jumps out. So you can construct these metrics quickly after auctions happen and then select sectors and potentially even individual organizers for further investigation and scrutiny in terms of how the auction was held and whether there was an improper exclusion of some competing firms or an improper selection of the winning firm.
Oh, that's very important and also very useful, especially given that recently Ukraine has been shaken by a big corruption scandal involving Timur Mindic, one of the president's friends, and an alleged large-scale corruption in the energy sector. So that's exactly the kind of story that makes the headlines in Western media and can fuel skepticism about further support of Ukraine. And so, from the perspective of your research, how should we interpret a scandal like the Mindic case? Is it mainly evidence of deep-rooted corruption, or can it also be seen as a sign that Ukraine's anti-corruption institutions are actually working and uncovering schemes that used to stay hidden?
Yeah, I think it's definitely the latter. I think we should all be impressed that under conditions of wartime, Ukraine's anti-corruption agencies are working and investigating and uncovering these schemes and going after people who are very high up. This is exactly what we want from anti-corruption agencies, because the more people, the real way to root out corruption is to make it not profitable. And the way to make it not profitable is to increase the probability that you will be caught and punished if you try to do it. And that can become a self-fulfilling prophecy in the sense that if people believe it's not profitable, they won't try it, and you won't even have to, arrest anybody. So I think it's fantastic that Ukraine is not saying, okay, well, we can't arrest anybody because that would make us look bad. Or, we have other things to worry about. We don't have time to go after corrupt actors. I think that would be the wrong attitude. So I think we should be encouraged by the developments that we're seeing and remember that again, just because we're not hearing about corruption, for example, in Russia, there's no freedom of press. And so Russia is almost surely much, much more corrupt than Ukraine, but you don't hear nearly as much about it because it's such a closed society where a lot of the corruption goes unpunished. When we see corruption being punished, that should make us think that the system is working.
Well, exactly. And the cases like the Mindich case, it's not only about corruption, this is also about politics because events like that, they matter politically because they can influence how parliaments or taxpayers in donor countries feel about sending money to Ukraine. And so if you were advising Western policymakers or donors, what indicators would you tell them to watch to distinguish between a country where corruption is spiraling out of control and a country where institutions are getting stronger and more capable of exposing wrongdoing?
Yeah, so I think some of the metrics that we have developed are good ones to watch. Beyond that, I think looking at transparency and freedom of the press is very important. I think looking at, whether the public tolerates corruption or not, because ultimately, when donors give money or weapons to Ukraine, they're not giving them to the politicians in the sense that, it's not about are the politicians worth helping or not? It's about whether the Ukrainian people are worth helping or not. And I think the Ukrainian people have shown themselves to be dedicated to building a society that is free of corruption. I think when there was an attempt to reduce the independency of the anti-corruption agency, we saw people rise up against that. And that is very encouraging. So I would say, our metrics are also very useful, but also keep your eye on the Ukrainian people and how hard they're fighting, both for their freedom and for a country that is free of corruption. And that's where we really want to focus our attention. The other thing I will say is, we do study data from before the full-scale invasion. After the full-scale invasion, things changed in the sense that some of the data became less readily available, but scrutiny of money going into Ukraine rose dramatically. So it's not as though donors are just sending checks to Ukraine and nobody is checking up on them. Aid to Ukraine is among the most heavily audited aid, if not the most heavily audited aid that we've seen uh, in recent history and maybe ever. So I think a lot of the aid is being scrutinized, and clearly the anti-corruption agencies are working too.
Oh, that's very good to know. So let's end with the future and with some concrete policy suggestions. Your work gives us a more nuanced picture of where the problems are and how to measure them. So, if you had to recommend 2 or 3 priority reforms to reduce corruption in Ukraine and reassure Western taxpayers that their money is being spent well, what would they be? And looking 5 years ahead, what trends in the data would convince you that Ukraine has really turned a corner on corruption?
Mm. Yeah, that's a really, really great questions. I would say digitization is very important and very useful, both for transparency, because then observers, including journalists and independent investigators, have an easier time tracing what's happening with money. It also makes it harder for corrupt actors to try to ask for payments under the table if everything is digital. Ukraine has been moving in that direction, which is great, but there's more digitalization that can be done. I think making the Anti-Corruption Bureau even more independent in terms of its own budget. So true independence requires that you have a guaranteed budget and that your independence cannot be messed with by anybody. Again, I think Ukraine has already almost there, but there's more that can be done. I think ideally, we would also try to raise the salaries of the civil servants. That is a harder thing to do in the short run, of course, because Ukraine's budget is very strained by the war effort. But I think if there are more donors willing to step up, funding public service positions better would be helpful. Those are the main ones, I would say. And I would like to see the metrics that we've developed in the next 5 years to see how they stack up. I wouldn't say that I would see it as turning a corner because as much as I have criticized the perception-based index, if you look at it, Ukraine turned a corner in 2014. So, for example, before 2014, Ukraine and Russia's corruption indices were pretty similar to each other. Since 2014, Ukraine has moved up in the ranks in the good direction, while Russia has stagnated or even fell in ranks. So I think Ukraine turned a corner over 10 years ago. And it's now, but the rest of the world's perceptions are still catching up. Again, problems remain. I don't want to say that it can't do better. It absolutely can and should do better. And so I just hope for continued improvement in these metrics and, continued improvement in the metrics that we have developed and potentially also in the perception-based metrics as well, because those unfortunately can still matter to donors.
Oh, yes, indeed. Well, Tatyana, thank you so much for joining me and for helping us think more clearly about what corruption in Ukraine actually looks like and what policymakers should focus on. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Olga.
This has been Policy Implications. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and stay tuned for more conversations on Ukraine's economy, institutions, and the challenges of reconstruction. I also encourage you to donate to support Ukraine. You'll find information on trusted ways to do so in the episode description.